Was there a cover-up in the killing of Gordon Kahl? Here now discussing this subject are Len Martin, Jack McLam, and Ron Poach. And to introduce the program, here is Ron Poach, pastor of Lord's Covenant Church, Scottsdale, Arizona.
We welcome you to the program today, and we're presenting this video not because we like a fight, not because we're opposed to truth, and not because we enjoy controversy, but because we love truth and justice, because we believe in freedom in America, because we want you to know the facts. We feel that you're deserving of a response from some men of understanding of the times and what took place in Medina, North Dakota, February the 13th, 1983, in the tragic murder of Gordon Kahl and the attack upon citizens whose rights were heavily infringed upon by the government of these United States of America. It seems like there's a lot of opposition today to get the facts out into the public. We're conducting this forum today, and I'd like you to be introduced to the men on the forum because they're going to give some startling information and reveal some facts that are involved in a massive scheme of cover-up. Perhaps not since John F. Kennedy was killed has there been such a massive cover-up of facts that you need to be informed of to make rational decisions as to the future of this country. We've lost the court system, it seems, and justice is not prevailing. As a matter of fact, today there are between 400 and 800 ministers alone that are behind bars because they are fighting for individual rights that you, as Americans, are losing on a rapid and grandiose scale. Have with us today at America's Promise two men, one from the law enforcement field, one from the journalistic field, and both of these men were very much interested in what happened in Medina, North Dakota, because they knew it would ultimately affect not only North Dakota people, but affect the nation. So we're glad that you've tuned in today, and we welcome you to the forum, and I'd like to introduce to you, first of all, on my immediate right, a man in law enforcement that's well respected in the law enforcement community, and his name is Jack McLam, and I'd like him to introduce himself and give his credentials.
Thank you, Ron. I've spent the last 10 years in law enforcement, having just retired from the Phoenix Police Department in June of this year. It was during this time that I became acquainted with Len Martin on my right and heard about the Medina situation. To give you a little background on myself, during the 10 years I was with the Phoenix Police Department, I served in a variety of capacities. The majority of my time was spent in the patrol division, working various details. Another area was with the intelligence gang squad of the Phoenix Police Department. And I have, in my off-duty time, developed and produced a national publication to law enforcement officers on constitutional issues and issues of constitutional law. I also have a National Crime Prevention Association called the American Citizen and Lawman Association. So the last 10 years of my life, Ron, has been spent pretty much just absorbed in the criminal justice system.
All right, another man that's joined us in the forum today is Len Martin. Len has written books such as Wanted, Why They Wanted to Get Gordon Kahl. And then there's another book that he's written, a little pamphlet called Hey Mr. Income Tax Man, I Need Some Answers. The Truth About Gordon Kahl, Radical Tax Protester. Questions that we need to address today. What kind of men were the U.S. Marshals who attacked Gordon Kahl? And we expect some input from, of course, Jack McLam. In a more recent publication, Moscow on the Prairie, how seemingly the globalist scheme and those enemies that are trying to get the breadbasket of this nation are working very much overtime to destroy the very principles which made this nation great. So I introduce to you today with great pleasure. We're glad to have you here, Len, and I want you to address some questions, but first, would you give the people some credentials? You've been in Washington for 6 years, based as an individual who was a writer and a script writer for different patriotic groups. Please tell the people today.
Okay, thank you, Ron. I was a school teacher for 12 years in our public school system, not knowing that much of the history that we were teaching was distorted and even false. As I look back upon that experience, it disturbs me, because our youth of America are being given a raw deal, and then they are the ones that are going to pay the price in the future. I went to Washington on a tax protest. I was going to stay down there 2 weeks. When I started to find out the things that are going on in our government, which is a wonderful government, but it's been taken over by subversive forces, I stayed down there, and 4 months later I became a radio scriptwriter, and then I went onto my own, came back to North Dakota, went back to Washington at times, back to North Dakota, writing books, and working to try to preserve a free country for our young people. At the time of the Medina shootout, if we want to call it that, I was teaching in a Christian school. And this brings us up to the point, the thing that we are going to discuss today, I understand, and that is the attack on Gordon Kahl at Medina.
We have in front of us a raft of materials that dealt with that situation. Newspaper clippings. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. Having been in Atlanta and having seen what took place, Len, the national hysteria that was associated with Gordon Kahl, I want to ask you personally the question, what kind of man was Gordon Kahl? You hear so much about posse comitatus and radicalism and neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism. These words get thrown around with a lot of ease by the media and those people who control the news. You, I understand, lived about 7 miles or grew up 7 miles from where Gordon Kahl lived. Please inform the people today. What kind of man was this Gordon Kahl?
Well, when the war broke out in the Second World War, June 7th, within 2 months, Gordon Kahl had enlisted in the Air Force. He served with distinction, and when he came back after discharge from the service, he went back to the farm. He'd gotten married towards the end of the war, and during the time that I knew Gordon, not once did I ever hear of him drinking, smoking, swearing, or even using a dirty word. Towards the end of the war, he had found out that things were not quite as we have been taught in school as far as history. And things that happened during the war stirred his thinking and his inquisitive mind. So when he was in his free time, after getting the crop in and so forth, he did a lot of research. People that knew Gordon and his wife Joan said that he never believed everything that he read. He would have books all over the floor, checking and double checking, cross-reference, and to prove that it was right or wrong. He met a lot of people in his travels, and this helped to him to understand the problems that we're facing in America. Many people now are discovering that things are not quite the way that it appears in the news media, our textbooks. Gordon was more, besides studying that, was more concerned with who is behind the scenes, who is causing all of these problems. And after the shootout at Medina, the news media had to admit, after talking to the Kahl's neighbors, that Gordon was the most helpful person and just about as fine a man as you'd ever want.
Well, it seems to me there's a great deal of opposition that's come out by the major media networks to eliminate these facts from getting into public. As a matter of fact, it seems overwhelming to me and awesome that there's been a suppression of news. I've heard, and of course have read, that he was a violent tax protester. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, they tossed around the words violent, militant, anti-government, any authority to discredit him. Probably, if we're going to understand this whole situation, we'll have to understand the news media. And I can best tell that by quoting John Swinton of the New York Times, who was editor of the New York Times. And at a banquet for fellow newsmen, the editor, John Swinton, said, "If you fellows know it, and I know it, that if we were to utter what we really felt, it would not appear in print. We trade our time, our talents, our energies for a salary. We are marionettes, and the rich people behind the scenes pull the strings, and we dance. We are nothing but intellectual prostitutes." Now, these are the people that were telling about Gordon Kahl. And I can relate, during the trial, there were two reporters that we had met that tried to do as good a job as they can. They were very concerned about the way that the incident was being reported. And we said, "Well, why don't you write about this?" They said, "We would like to, but we know that the big boys aren't going to let it go through anyway, so why waste the time?" So they called Gordon Kahl a radical tax protester, militant posse comitatus member. I think that if we're going to understand the shooting at Medina, we will have to discuss both of those areas, the income tax and the posse comitatus.
Speaking of the posse comitatus, a lot of people don't realize it's a Latin word, or they think it immediately means a renegade group of radicals that are communists. Jack, could you, perhaps from law enforcement, can you clue us in on really what the word means, or the etymology of the word, so that the people, the viewers that are looking on and listening in, will be able to make a rational decision that the word posse comitatus is not an evil word. As a matter of fact, it's written into many of the codes, state codes of these United States of America.
Yes, it is. I was quite interested myself over 8 years ago when this term first came to me while I was in law enforcement. There was supposedly a certain group in our country going by that name, and of course I couldn't find that information in our state laws and so forth, and it is there, but basically the word means power of the county, power of the people. And those people in law enforcement that banty this word around in the media understand it and have been told that this is not a legal entity, but it's a group of very radical and wild and right-wing fanatics that are involved in this, and the word racism comes out and so forth. And so to those of us in law enforcement, it was a very evil word, and when someone was called posse comitatus member, it was now being used to smear someone terribly and to make an officer very leery of becoming involved in a close encounter with these type of individuals, which of course builds the possibility for a dangerous situation. So the posse comitatus to law enforcement or government officials is a very negative term, and is similar to saying the John Dillinger gang or something like that. It brings a lot of animosity and also fear and caution in the lives of police officers. So what I'd like to do, instead of me giving a definition of what it truly is turn this over to Len, who understands much better the actual true beginning of posse comitatus and the legal structure.
Well, the posse comitatus goes back to the early beginnings of our country. In fact, it goes back to England. But for our interest, it is just necessary to say that before counties were formed, or before the sheriff was elected, the posse was the law in the county. When the sheriff became elected, why the posse was available to be called upon by the sheriff to help him enforce the law. Little by little, the posse, through neglect by the sheriff to use the posse, kind of passed into oblivion. As for the negative attitude that people have towards the posse has been the result of media hype. That is, they've been telling the people this, and if they don't know any difference, that's the way they're going to believe.
Well, is there any precedent or is there any law written in North Dakota or any one of the states that you can share with us today that would have any bearing on the Gordon Kahl case?
You bet, and that's necessary, because we can talk from here till doomsday, and it isn't going to be effective until we can show facts. And after the shootout, there was so much discussion about the posse, because they would say Gordon Kahl's a posse member, as if the posse was a bad vigilante group. And a report was published in the North Dakota Law Review, 1985. And it says, the introduction to the Posse Comitatus Act. And it went back to give a little bit of history, and it says, the term Posse Comitatus means the entire population of a county above the age 15, which a sheriff may summon for assistance in the performance of his duties. Now that means you and me and those news reporters that were saying the nasty things about Gordon being a Posse Comitatus member are kind of out of line, aren't they? And it says, the Posse Comitatus Act appears to have derived its name from the use of military troops as a Posse Comitatus to assist federal marshals in the performance of their duties under the Judiciary Act of 1789. Then we go on. After the Civil War, the North was trying to keep order in the South, and the military was used to help keep order. They went a little too far. They started to interfere too much into the civilian activities. And there was a complaint made. Congress passed a law that said that the military cannot interfere in the activities in civilian life. That was the duty of the people themselves. So the Congress in 1789 passed the first legislation authorizing the use of the Posse Comitatus. And then it said that, if I can find it quickly here, it was passed by President Hayes on June 18th, 1878, and the Posse Comitatus Act became law. That is out of the North Dakota Law Review, 1985.
So actually the Posse Comitatus is a legitimate law enforcement body of people that are conscripted into service from any given county, 15 years of age and up. Am I to believe that that's exactly what we're dealing with here?
That's what the North Dakota Law Review said.
Well, before we can really get involved into the Gordon Kahl case and to go into it in detail that what happened in Medina, I think it's important for us to realize that he had supposedly a record that went back of being a tax protester that went back to Texas. Can you comment on that? Can you brief the people so they get a historical background and sketch of what was brewing and taking place up until that 15th?
Well, Gordon did stop paying income taxes. He didn't deny it. In fact, unlike most people who just simply drop out, and by the way, the estimate now that there are in excess of 20 million people who have stopped paying income taxes.
Now, that was in 1975, wasn't it? That
Yeah,
report?
well, yes, and it's grown since then. In fact, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, appearing before one of the committees in Congress, admitted there were 5 million. Well, if there are 5 million, you can imagine that it's much more than that. And that was 1985, and the tax protest has grown tremendously.
Wasn't it 1975?
Yes, and it has grown tremendously since then, partly because more people are finding out that they are not required to file income tax, and partly because the economic situation has forced them into saying, well, am I going to feed my family or I'm going to pay the tax?
Well, before we go any further, we're going to do another tape not on the subject of Gordon Kahl, but on the subject of this book right here that's in front of me. And we're going to make this available also, The Law That Never Was. And this, would you care to comment on that just briefly here?
Well, yes. Well, the former fraud investigator for the state of Illinois tax division, Bill Benson, went around to the 48 contiguous states that were in the Union in 1913 when the 16th Amendment was passed. And he discovered that not one of them had filled all of the requirements required to make it a constitutional amendment.
All right, well, we'll get on that in another
Yeah,
tape, but I wanted to ask you, what was Gordon Kahl originally charged with?
He was charged with failure to file. And failure to file is listed under U.S. or the Title 26, it is, of the U.S. Code. Now, Title 26 has never been passed by Congress. Consequently, it is no law. Title 18 has been passed by Congress. Title 26, no. When he was charged with this, he was charged on what was called information, just the information on hand. They did not follow the constitutional requirement of calling a grand jury and getting a grand jury indictment. Now, you're familiar with this, Jack.
I certainly am.
And have they a right to use information to arrest a person like that?
There's a lot of things in our judicial system today, as you know, Len, that have developed because the people themselves have not been aware of how the judiciary should function. And one of the areas is the area you're speaking about only having a government agent come in and present a packet of information, or maybe just one sheet of information accusing you of a crime. And they will use this, what's called an information, to go get a warrant and have you arrested, where, of course, constitutionally they are to go before a grand jury of people in the community and have them decide if there's enough information, if there's enough actual facts to warrant, we call it a preponderance of evidence, in order for them to decide to issue a warrant in these situations. And so that's the difference between the two systems.
Well, this is the thing that was pointed out, that Gordon wasn't legally charged, that he was appearing before a judge who was acting in a dictatorial manner. He was being charged on a law that wasn't even passed by Congress. He was being charged by an attorney, and Gordon should not have been tried in a court in Texas. In fact, Gordon had challenged the jurisdiction of the judge. And according to law, am I correct on this, Jack? Once the jurisdiction has been challenged, the judge has to prove his jurisdiction.
That's correct,
All
yes.
right. The judge just simply ignored him. Gordon used various avenues of defense. Judge, and by the way, the name of the judge was Suttle, S-U-T-T-L-E, Judge Suttle. He denied everything that Gordon brought up in defense. Gordon tried to have a person who was knowledgeable in the Constitution as his advisor, or his, what is the word, Jack? Counsel. Counsel is the word.
Yes.
By and by, the judge just forced him into accepting an attorney. And no place in the Constitution does it say that you're required to hire an attorney or lawyer. Those words are not, no place in the Constitution. Yet Gordon was forced to go that avenue. And now we're getting into what is called the courts, and this is something that really makes me sick as a former school teacher, is that these things are not taught in school. We are not taught the laws that we work and live under. Now, there are three types of laws: common law, which they refer to as in-law, is that right? At law.
At law.
Equity, and maritime law. Maritime law was the law of the sea, where the captain was the law. What he said was it. And equity, if it's handled right, is fair, where the judge can has leeway to say, well, the person is guilty of the crime, but circumstances are such that rather than put him to jail for 5 years, I think that probably 6 months would be sufficient. It gives an honest judge the chance to administer justice fairly. But what has happened, they brought this maritime law, the law of the captain, where the captain is the law, and meshed them together. So the captain now stands or sits behind the bench in the robe as the captain, making decisions in law and working as a dictator. And they've even gone so far now as to mesh common law in with it. So we have nothing but the captain's court. I asked a friend of mine, actually I became a friend of his when I found out that he was a former judge. And this issue of common law is getting quite hot in North Dakota right now, because people are going common law, and the legal beagles up there are fighting it tooth and nail. And I asked this person, what's the basis for common law? He says, it's what our country was founded on. That was the law in America until the judges and lawyers messed it all up. So we're living in a legal jungle now that allows the judge to manipulate the court system. That is, runs the court system.
And the outcome of many trials.
And the outcome of it, that's right.
Many trials.
That's right. And this is what Gordon was facing in Texas. And they found him guilty. The judge virtually told the jury to bring in a guilty verdict by virtue of this. These are the instructions I give to you, and you must follow them. And they disallowed everything that would help Gordon.
Now, did he leave Texas with a clean slate, or, I mean, was he a free man when he left jail, being incarcerated?
Well, he received two sentences: 1 year for count 1 year, and $2,000 fine and probation for count 2. When he went to prison, 1 month after he went to prison, I should say, the authorities came to him and said, Gordon, we'll let you out on probation if you will agree to these terms: file income tax reports and not associate with anyone who is in the fight that way. Gordon says, forget it. He says, I will serve my full time, because when I go out that door, I want to go out a free man and not be in chains of probation. So when he walked out of prison, he walked out under the understanding that he was a free man. He gets back to North Dakota, and lo and behold, here comes a probation officer and saying, you're violating probation. Gordon says, oh no.
I need Jack's input here. Having served as a police officer with sterling record, what goes on at an academy? What kind of climate is produced for U.S. Marshals to shoot law-abiding citizens? What kind of mindset, what kind of inclination, what kind of philosophy is being presented so that police officers act in a very irresponsible way? We need to know this. What's happening?
This is a very interesting topic of what goes on today in our police academies throughout the United States, both federal, state, and local. During the last 3 years I've been producing a national newsletter to lawmen, I've found out that what I'm about to tell you is very similar to the instruction given at academies throughout the United States.
Well, could you show that paper, Jack, to
This is
the public?
some of the newsletters that I've been producing for the last 3 years, Aid and Abet newsletter. And this goes specifically to law enforcement officers. And if you were to read one of these, you would understand that it's written in lawman's language. We use terminology different than what you would hear if you were talking to a banker or to a postman or something like that. So it's directed towards law enforcement officers, and we discuss such issues as to why we are being trained today in such a fashion, and other constitutional issues that have to deal with our daily lives as law enforcement personnel today. But back to the question of what's occurring in the academies. 10 years ago, I was rather an older gentleman than one that presents themselves to law enforcement academies in the United States. I came from the business world at the age of 32. I was in business in California, had a chemical business for a number of years, and I became interested in the area of law enforcement, and when I moved to Arizona, I went down and checked it out and decided I would like to try working in the civil service area and helping the communities. So when I presented myself to the Academy in 1976, I was astounded to find that I was the oldest person. They called me the granddad at 32 because they had all these young, impressionable young men and women of 20 and 21 years of age that were my classmates. It was interesting to me as I sat back and listened to the instructors come in and instruct these young people in the philosophies of life, and also instruct them in things that a person 25, 30, and 40 years of age already know, and that's how to deal with people and how to tactfully become involved in people's personal problems without escalating the perhaps violent situation. And so there's a lot of psychology that goes into police work.
Well, did you, let me ask you this, did you agree with the philosophy that was being presented when you were going to school in '76?
Most of the philosophy was very accurate, but some of it I understood was way off base from what I had learned from years of dealing with people in the business world and in the community. For example, I would hear terms such as you can't trust the citizens out there. You must learn that if you're ever in trouble and you need help as a lawman, you can only trust your brother officers and call upon them for assistance in times that you need help, and things such as you're no longer a citizen. We were told, and many officers are told all over the United States, that they're not citizens any longer. Once they become a police officer, they become a government entity unto themselves, and they are raised above the citizens to a level above them so they can better supervise the masses for their own good. And we're also taught things such as there will be times, ladies and gentlemen, that you'll be asked to do things, be called upon to do things to a fellow citizen that you won't necessarily like to do, but you must do it for the benefit of the whole, for the benefit of society. And so what I saw is in these fertile minds ideas that separated, further widened the gap of communication and involvement between these law enforcement people and the community. And I couldn't help but think when I was raised, the local sheriff and the local police were friends and buddies and community members. You did things together. They'd take you fishing. They'd go to club meetings with you. And they were actual real people. So you might ask, why are we being trained? Are these law enforcement people today being trained in a different manner today? I believe personally that as a society begins to break down, when the moral values are removed from society, as we see happening in the United States today, something will run in and fill the gap. And what it is a strong arm of law enforcement, the strong arm of government will come in to fill the gap that's been devoid of any religious or moral atmosphere. And so officers today are being prepared to do what they are told to do, regardless of what that act is, for the good of society. The end justifies the means mentality that we see used in so many other countries throughout the world.
Who is it that tells you what to do then? Is that your...
Well, every officer has a supervisor, unless you're the chief of police, and then he has a supervisor. Who tells you?
The attorney, the U.S. attorneys and the state's attorneys.
Oh, I know what you mean, Len. There is a hierarchy in law enforcement, and a local police officer will bow and scrape to a state officer, and a state officer will bow and scrape to a federal officer. This is not the way it should be, because a police officer, a sworn police officer in a local small town has just as much authority and is just as much a police officer in this United States as the federal marshals, the FBI, and those organizations. But for some reason, the officers tend to, well, it's a taught thing that we are subservient to these federal marshals if you're a local police officer.
This brings it up to the point, who triggered, who sent out, who gave the orders to set up that confrontation at Medina? And it's never been satisfactorily answered yet.
One of the things that people I know are going to want to ask you, since you were close to the situation, are what are the circumstances that provoked the attack? What laws were being violated? One of the things that most people that are viewing are going to come to understand is that the facts have been twisted, or we've been lied to. And this is a continual thing that we as Americans have put up with for the last several decades, or 100 years perhaps. But we know that one thing will set us free, and Jesus said it. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And we want you to be free, and we want you to make decisions based upon facts and getting the other side of the story. And one of the things that I want you to address, Len, as we close out this first tape is, what were the circumstances that led up to that terrible, tragic shooting on February the 13th?
Well, this is really strange, because the July 1985, before the shooting, the U.S. Marshals Service in Washington sent out word to the head marshal in North Dakota, Muir, to put away the file on Gordon Kahl. Don't expend any more energy on it. It's not worth it.
Do you concur that this could happen in this country? I mean, seriously, it's just about overwhelming to think that it can happen in our country.
Well, I'll tell you, it hasn't just happened in our country, and it was very difficult for me as a law enforcement officer to understand just how far we have gone down that road towards that ugly term we don't like to think about, and that's the socialization and humanization of the United States. And we're very far down that road, and this is the example of what can happen when God is put aside in a nation and the government's full might comes to bear, and they are the arbitrators of what's right and wrong and no longer the Lord.
Well, thanks for joining us today, folk, and we trust that we've been able to help you and assist you in your quest for truth to find out the true story of what happened in the Gordon Kahl episode. May God help us to wake up.
This program is brought to you by Lord's Covenant Church and is available on either VHS or beta. If you'd like a catalog of our tapes, books, and pamphlets, or if you'd like to be on our mailing list, write Lord's Covenant Church, Post Office Box 4444, Scottsdale, Arizona 85261. Was there a cover-up in the killing of Gordon Kahl? Here now discussing this subject are Len Martin, Jack McClam, and Ron Poach. And this is part 2. And here to introduce the program is Ron Poach.
Thanks again for joining us today on part 2 of the Medina incident, North Dakota, what happened to Gordon Kahl. We live with a conventional understanding of, hey, I'm an American. America is a leader in the free world. We've been taught to pledge allegiance to the flag, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. Was justice accomplished that night of February the 13th, 1983? We have with us today, I'm very, very happy to present to you, two distinguished gentlemen. One from a law enforcement agency, Jack McClam. Good to have you with us, Jack.
Nice to be
here. Also, it's good to have with us Len Martin, and he's been a correspondent in Washington, D.C., and he's very, very much aware of what's happening to the erosion of values in this land that we know as America. So, gentlemen, welcome, and I'd like to begin the second part by asking the question, what's happened in America? What happened that the natural organic law that's been supplanted and eroded, and who are the instigators of this present parasitic law that we've been saddled with?
You mean you want to get down to the nitty-gritty? Is this right?
I think that's what everyone wants to
Well,
know.
let's put it this way. Let's approach it from what Gordon Kahl was pointing out. And there are many of us, in fact, a growing number of people who realize that this is correct. Now, you have heard people say, oh, it's the Jews' fault. Well, I take exception to this because I have many Jewish friends who don't like what is going on. But there is a faction of that, those who call themselves Jews, who are causing a tremendous amount of trouble, and that is the hierarchy. And Gordon was very careful to point out the higher-ups, the wealthy, the super wealthy. People say, well, I don't know if I want to believe that. Well, you're going to either believe it or at least look into it, or we're going to be facing some even more serious problems in America.
Could you comment, Len, on what took place at the incident of the shooting? What happened that night, as best as has been recounted to you, being very close to the North Dakota town of Medina?
All right, let's go back just a week, though, to Ashley. Those people, including the deputy or the police officer from Medina, were at Medina, were at Ashley for the meeting, and it was agreed by all that they would meet the following week at Medina. There was no secret, and Mr. Graff said that he would be there. On Thursday before that, one of the 3 people that are in jail now asked Cappy again, "Are you going to be there Sunday?" He said, "Yes, I'll be there." But he wasn't there. And well, didn't think too much of it, but towards the end of the meeting, or at the end of the meeting actually, and they went outside the cars, they noticed a pickup parked across or to the north, about a block away. And it was determined that the deputy sheriff, Brad Kapp, was in there and watching the meeting, or people coming out of the meeting with binoculars. And this created quite a concern. The fellows went back in, and after talking with Mrs. Kahl, I went back in with them, and Dave Brewer called the chief of police, Kapp, and asked him what's up. And no really satisfactory answer. Of course, the thing is, I wasn't paying close attention to it, but as I understand that it had to do with an APB that was out on Scott Fall's car, and nothing serious. And they called back a second time. And the thing that Dave Brewer remembered was that, and it seemed odd, that Graff picked up that phone almost before the tone the bell had rung out, stopped ringing. They didn't feel that there was any. Well, they had said to Gordon, they might be, or his son said, the authorities might be after you. He said, "Oh, Yori, we've heard this so many times." He said, "This is just another incident." But the others, a little bit new to them, they said, "Well, take some caution, take some precautions in trying to get home." And so Yori convinced his dad to change jackets with him. He did that. And someone said, "Hey, Lynn, Gordon needs a cap." So I had a brown stocking cap, and he put that on. And they thought in order to get Gordon home safely, they didn't know what to expect. They thought maybe some of the local boys just trying to make a name for themselves. At least this was the impression that I got from it. So they left in 2 cars, and instead of splitting and trying to avoid any type of confrontation, they both went out together and went north. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but a car drove up to the clinic and said, "Hey, Gordon, they're setting you up." And they left and they went north anyway. I headed south. I followed Gordon out of town. In fact, we shook hands just before he went out the car. Gordon didn't say a word. And it's the last handshake we had. I stopped at Medina at the home of Dave Brewer. His wife didn't feel well that day, so she didn't go along. We were going to wait till Dave came back. It wasn't long, and Dave did come back. He told his daughters, "Go upstairs, please." He turned to us, he says, "6 are dead." And he was shaking. He's a very calm person. He thought at the time 6 people had died. We asked him, "Were any of our boys?" "No, but Yori is shot up pretty badly." And then we found out later, as it was reconstructed, that Muir, after arguing or talking back and forth, I don't think that's quite right. Let's put it this way. 2 cars came from the north. One of them was driven by the head marshal Muir, the other car by the deputy cop from
Now, this
Medina.
Muir, this was the same man that was told to put away the file on
That's
Gordon
right.
Kahl?
That's right. He was the head marshal. And the two cars saw them coming, and they formed a roadblock like this. And so they tried to turn around and avoid a confrontation. That's when the Ram Charger with Cheshire, one of the other marshals that was shot, pulled up behind them. and blocked off they couldn't get away anyway. And it was admitted that the police officers, marshals, and that had their guns out of the windows. They jumped out of the car before the cars even stopped, and as Dave told it, and it fits in with the other reports, that when he looked up, they were looking into the barrels of guns. But Yorrie did jump out and went to behind a telephone pole. Gordon stepped out and confronted the marshals. Dave Brewer...
Did he say anything to them at the time?
I don't know about that, if he did right at the moment, but there was talking going back and forth. Dave Brewer was told by one of the marshals to go towards the ditch, and he said, I'm not going to take it. Oh, I thought, I won't get a chance. I don't want to take a chance of getting shot in the back. So he turned out, put his feet on the floor, and his hand on his lap, which is, isn't this acceptable? I mean, the man says, leave me alone, I'm not going to do anything?
Yes.
Okay. Gordon said, well, there was an indication that there might be, the marshals might be up some mischief, because they said, we're going to blow your blankety-blank heads off, you're dead, we're going to blow your heads off. And this was repeated quite often, according to the Mrs. Kahl and the others that were there, some of the others that were there. They argued, Gordon said, well, look, this is not the way to do things. Let's put our guns down and we'll discuss this another day. And they thought, after, reported from 5 minutes to 9 minutes, time is hard to judge when things like that are going on. So they thought it was over. All at once there was a shot. And Yorrie said, Dad, I'm hit, I'm hit. And then there were several other shots. Now, there was a Marine that was within here, that was just a short ways away at the roadblock, and he said, it's easy to distinguish between a rifle shot and a pistol shot. And he says that was definitely a pistol shot. The only person, Marshal there, that had a pistol was Marshal Muir. Yorrie, by the way, that bullet hit. Yorrie had a pistol holster in here, and it hit the handle. The gun did show up at the end of the trial. The bullet was still there. And that is a key point of evidence that Judge Benson didn't allow in court. Anyway, Yorrie got shot twice more, once with a rifle, twice with a shotgun, once in the belly, and once part of it caught his chin.
And up to this time, there were no other shots exchanged by the people who were being arrested or threatened,
No.
the citizens, the
That's
farmers.
Right. That's when Gordon, with his son being shot, and I've heard many people say, if I'd have seen my son get shot, I'd have done the same thing Gordon did. The only thing about Gordon is he was very quick. You wouldn't think so, he's so easygoing, but he, when the smoke cleared, Muir, Cheshire was dead. Hobson, they said Hobson was shot. Actually, a shell had hit the blacktop, and that hit him in the face. And one of the deputy sheriff had a finger missing, and the deputy police officer was shot in the butt. And Gordon was in total control. Now, they call him, insinuate that he's a killer. He could have killed every one of them. But he didn't, because that way all he wanted to do was defend, bring the situation under control.
Well, I've got to ask Jack at this time a question. As an officer, one who's undergone training, the techniques and the tactics that were used, that presented to you at this place at this time, as has been rehearsed by Mr. Martin, what's your appraisal of the situation as a professional officer?
I think the best way to explain that is, let me take you back to when I first heard of this situation. I first heard of this situation in a law enforcement briefing in Phoenix, Arizona, where it was described to us the shooting and what had occurred. It was odd at that time that during this very brief update to law enforcement people in Arizona, I guess it was because that Gordon Kahl was on the loose at that time, and all law enforcement agencies briefed their men all throughout the country. But at that time I was amazed that we had heard that the purpose of this roadblock situation was to serve a misdemeanor warrant. And a misdemeanor warrant, for the public and those that might view our film here, they should understand, let's look at this situation as if you had received a traffic ticket and you had not paid for that traffic ticket and a warrant had been issued for your arrest. That is a misdemeanor warrant. Now, in law enforcement training, we are taught that you will, and it's the most basic elementary teaching in any police academy, that you do not serve any warrants, be they felony warrants, which this was not, or misdemeanor warrants at a time that several situations are evolving. Number one, you will never try to serve a warrant, and that is make an arrest for an outstanding warrant, be it felony or misdemeanor, if a person is with his peers or family. This is because in the struggle that might ensue, even the exchange of verbal confrontations and words, the man particularly has to save face. And if he's with his family and a confrontation comes about for him to be arrested, or with his buddies, the likelihood for a violent situation, or at least in a resisting arrest situation, struggle, might ensue are 1,000-fold greater than if you catch him when he's in the barber chair, when he's reading a newspaper on the corner, or in transit from his house to work, or in some other area of the neighborhood where he's without his friends and without his family. That's basic elementary police training. Another element is you will never try to effect a warrant arrest if not necessary when a person's armed. It just stands to reason. It's common sense. If you can effect an arrest when a person has shopping bags in their hands and they don't have a weapon on them, you're going to save the possibility of having a real violent, tragic end to your arrest scenario. Anyway, what I saw in this brief research that were giving to us in that briefing that day was that these men had gone out to serve a misdemeanor warrant, and what they were doing were actually violating the very principles and tactics of elementary law enforcement training. And so I didn't say anything at the time, but that gave me the impetus to reach out and try to get more information on what had happened in that situation in North Dakota. And what I found out, of course, what we had heard in briefing was basically true, what had occurred, but they left out a few things. For example, that misdemeanor warrant, or once again consider it would be like a traffic warrant for you, was not only being served in such a fashion that would possibly ignite violence, but it was also being served, and it was from another state. And never had I ever heard of a misdemeanor warrant from another state being served on a person in a state somewhere else outside of the state in which it was served. This is unheard of. It's just not done because it's such a small crime in comparison to felony warrants, that even if they had served that warrant out of state, the state wouldn't extradite. Because it's no one extradites, no law enforcement agency or criminal justice system that I've ever heard of extradite anyone on a misdemeanor warrant, such as a traffic warrant. If you went through a stoplight in Dakota, South Dakota, and they catch you in Florida, they're not going to, extradite you back to South Dakota to pay a fine on a traffic ticket.
Well, that brings me then, Len, to a question perhaps which you can answer, is that did politics enter into this case? If what Jack has said is highly unusual, it's never done, did politics enter into the case? But before you answer that, could you show us some pictures of the location of the shooting that took place that night? Could you describe them for us briefly?
All right. This was this is what you viewers are seeing on the screen. The Medina Clinic, the north view. This is the way that the deputy sheriff was carrying on a surveillance against the...
Now that's where you had the meeting?
Yeah, it's the meeting. All right, this is the lonely road heading north out of Medina. And right here at the bottom of the picture is the intersection where the shooting took place. Just to the north is where the two cars blocked off the road so that the Gordon and the rest of the family could not pass. This is the lonely stretch of road that where it took place. Here is the farm area, an abandoned farm where Gordon and Scott stayed that first night while they decided what they're going to do. Here is the one building where they did stay in. The next day, Scott surrendered, and Gordon, and we don't know how he did it, escaped.
One of the things I'd like to share with the viewers is that Mrs. Joan Kahl has conceded to share with you a heart-rending episode of what took place and her personal recollections of that evening. So we present to you Mrs. Joan Kahl.
Uri was shot down right away by Marshal Muir's gun, which was proven in court at the trial because we had an expert gunman there telling the first shot that was fired was from a high-powered pistol. And that was the first shot that was fired, and Uri was shot down right away. As we came from Medina, from the clinic, Dave Brewer and Gordon were in the first car, and Uri and I and Scott Fall and Wagner were in our own car in the station wagon. Uri and I in the front seat. I was in the passenger side, the same place I was when I went to the meeting. And as we come up over the hill, now there was these two cars parked shaped in a V. And I didn't see any red lights or anything. And I didn't see any flashing lights. But I knew then that there would be, I felt like there was going to be something happening. Well, what happened, Dave and Gordon drove ahead of us, and they turned around to go back south then again towards Medina when they saw this. And we were going to go too, but we didn't get completely turned around. We got right into Reardon's driveway, Uri and I and Scott, and just then we were enclosed in seconds, I would say in seconds, by all these marshals from Bismarck. The marshals were already there from Fargo, a fire truck and an ambulance and the city police. We were ambushed in seconds. There was no place anybody could go. And they jumped out of the marshals from Bismarck jumped out of their vehicles like wild terrorists. And there was Uri. Uri jumped out of our car then, and he went to the pole. Scott jumped out, and Scott was looking down the barrel of Hobson's gun. Uri was looking down the barrel of Cheshire's gun. And Uri said he thought every breath was his last one, because, and I'm going to say this, I don't like to use profanity, but I'm going to tell you, this is what happened. Cheshire says to Yori, I'm going to blow your goddamn heads off. And he repeated this over and over. It's just like a chant. Yori said he just kept coming at him, you know, it's chanting it, you know. And this Hobson was telling Scott, you're going to die. Well, they were looking down barrels at guns. And I got down on the floorboards, see. I didn't see this because I knew, you know, there was going to be something happening. And then I heard this voice. Gordon was very soft-spoken. I heard this voice, and I knew it was Gordon, but I couldn't tell what he was saying. And then later I found out he was saying, put down your guns and we'll talk. But there was no putting down guns with those people, because they were about to blow our heads off. They said it. It's by the grace of God that any of us were alive.
Now, if you could, Len, before we get into the politics of the case, and I asked the question, did politics enter into the case? Could you share with us what's happened to the others that were involved in that episode? What's happened to Gordon's son?
Gordon is, Yori is serving 2 life terms plus 15 years, as is Scott Fall. Now, ordinarily, they'll have them serving concurrently, that is, at the same time. No, they're having them consecutively. After they serve 1 life term, then they go on to another one. They don't want those boys out of jail for some straight reason.
There was another man, Vern Wagner. Didn't he turn state's evidence or something?
Yes, Vern Wagner turned state evidence. And they tried to get Dave to admit that to certain things. And as Joni, his wife, said, Dave isn't going to lie no matter what. So he is serving 10 years when he could be out if he wanted to turn state evidence. They asked Joan Kahl to plead guilty to a lesser charge. And she says, I'm not going to plead guilty to anything because I'm not guilty of anything. And fortunately, they did find her not guilty. Obviously, she couldn't have committed anything.
Well, let's get on to the jury trial.
All right.
I wanted to ask Jack, tell us something about the jury. What importance does it play in a case that was magnified by the press all over this country?
Well, the jury system itself today in the United States has changed drastically. In the 10 years I was in law enforcement, which was up till June this year, I have seen the jury system change with the insertion of new judicial laws, you might say, or regulations that allows the judge to pretty much today decide the outcome of a jury trial. Now, we know, of course, that that's not supposed to be in our nation, but most law enforcement officers today know, with voir dire of the jury, which is actually selecting jury members, we now understand that the federal agents have been caught a number of times doing background checks up to 2 months on prospective jurors before they even go to be selected as jurors, to find out who they want and what kind of individuals these people are before they're appointed to the juries. And so the government has months and months of background investigation to check on these proposed jurors, to find which ones have never ever even thought of violating a traffic law or asking a question of their government. And in the case of certain individuals like the group they call patriots in the country today, a jury can definitely be selected that disagrees totally with anyone that would ever question their government. And so juries today can be stacked. Now, if it's a rape or a murder or something like that, the judge can sit back and let the chips fall where they may. But being he gets his paycheck from the same place that law enforcement officers and other government officials get their paychecks, this is a very dangerous situation. And then we have the jury situation where the judge actually uses something called the exclusionary rule, where the judge can decide what evidence the jury hears. He can allow all the evidence in, or he can pick and choose the evidence which he doesn't want to have presented to the jury. In the case in Medina, I personally read transcripts where I saw crucial evidence withheld by that judge that would have turned perhaps the outcome of that trial in favor of the victims, which were, in my estimated opinion as a law enforcement person, were the citizens that were literally attacked by government agents. I say that, and I'm not happy about that, because I love my brother officers throughout this nation, but it's a sad day and a blight on our reputations across the nation, what happened in Medina. And so the jury, there's other things too, but I don't want to get too involved in answering your question, where the jury today is really not free to make decisions in specific cases if the judge doesn't want to allow that to be done.
Well, I've got to ask you then, Mr. Martin, was the jury under any pressure by the judge and by the federal marshals, and what was the atmosphere that surrounded the trial by the presence of, were there more federal marshals or governmental officials there than normally would be at it?
When they were transporting the 3 prisoners, and by the way, they had them chained so tightly that they could hardly move, they were witnessed, observed, being pushed into the van.
Now, who were the 3 prisoners?
Oh, Yori Kahl, Scott Fall, and Dave Brewer. The atmosphere around the courtroom was eerie. Marshals all over the place, and I hate to say this about an individual, individuals, but it looked as though they had been recruited from the worst of the underworld. As Jack said, the judges allow certain evidence and withhold certain evidence. The Judge Benson made a career, you might say, during the trial of not allowing certain evidence in. But there are 2 very important ones. Yori Kahl's gun showed up as the defense attorneys, or some of the defense attorneys, had finished their argument. Here was the bullet still in it, and Benson would not allow the judges to introduce it as evidence then, or to be discussed. He did, after it was over, allow it to be put in there, but it could not be pursued. This bullet in there would have shown that Yori didn't shoot, that it had to be, or that it had to be Muir that shot the first shot, the way it looks. That wasn't allowed. Now, you will see the letter that you appear looking at on the screen is a copy of the letter that Gordon Kahl wrote after the shooting and sent to authorities, or I don't know, to several different places he sent the letter. Judge Benson did not allow this letter in as evidence. In the letter, Gordon says, I did the shooting. He says, I didn't want to, but as a matter of protecting the family. This letter, as I say, Benson did not allow, even though a handwriting expert said that it was Gordon's writing. Now here,
How did they know it was his writing?
All right, they had some of Gordon's other handwriting to compare it to. Now we tried to get some of Gordon's writing so we could compare, and the marshals, in raiding the various places looking for, or to suppress evidence or whatever, took all of anything that Gordon had ever written, but they missed one, and it was a letter from, or a Mother's Day card from Gordon to Mrs. Kahl while he was in prison, and you can
We have that with us. And
yes, and this is what the viewers are looking at now. If you'll notice, the F on are made the same. You can compare the letters as the handwriting expert found that they are identical. There's no doubt that that was Gordon's writing.
But it was suppressed by the judge and wouldn't be allowed.
Wouldn't allow it as evidence. And then in this, as I said, he admitted that he shot the 2 marshals.
Jack, do you feel that this is a policy and procedure? Is this what's happening in the courts today?
Well, in law enforcement across this nation and in the judiciary, we find the mentality among the judges, the lawyers, and law enforcement officers that because of the terrible crime problem and the onrush of bigger and more powerful government, that a control factor needs to be instilled in the system. And they believe a control factor that overrides the Constitution and our rights is necessary at this time to care for the citizens and to supervise them in a fashion that's for all of our own goods. And so what we find is that the most crucial law we operate under today in law enforcement and the judiciary is the end justifies the means. It's no longer a nation of laws like we continue to want to say today. It's a nation of men. And tomorrow morning, these judges will get up from their bed and decide what the new law is for that day. And it's a terrible shame, but unless we change things, we're going to be under a complete dictatorship. And many officers across this nation see it coming.
There were two other things that, like you say, the end justifies the means. All right. One marshal that was shot, Cheshire, was buried without having the bullet taken out and checked. He was buried.
No autopsy?
No, they quickly buried him. There was no ballistic test taken on the bullet. And Marshal Muir was cremated. So they could not check back to how he was killed, whose bullet hit him in the heart. It was proven that Gordon had shot them, but they didn't want that.
May I say one other thing?
Sure.
I think it's critical and crucial to this program that we understand that the type of scenario that was laid out in that barren part of that county that day was not one of serving a warrant to make an arrest. I have spoke to lawmen across this nation, and none of them will agree that the way that confrontation came about, that the purpose of it was to serve a warrant in a fashion that would not ignite violence. Just the opposite. The words that were exchanged, the fact that they tried to serve this warrant when the people were armed, and while they embarrassed him in front of his family by some of the words that were said to him, would do nothing, as we know in law enforcement, but ignite a violent situation. So why was this done? That's the question that should be posed, I think.
As we conclude the second tape of the series that we're doing on what happened at Medina, North Dakota 2, that Patriot Gordon Kahl, we want you to know that there are things that you can do. You can seek the mind of the scriptures and pray that the situation in this country will change. There's also something that we'd like to do, and that's inform you that Uri Kahl is still in prison. We want to, through these tapes, give you the opportunity to see that he has a proper redress of grievance, and that he can apply an appeal, the decision of the court that day that sentenced him to 2 life sentences. There are expenses of investigation. And those of you that would like to contribute, we're going to set up a special fund and tell you how this can be accomplished. I thank you for your kind attention. I want to thank Mr. Martin and Mr. McLam for being here today and presenting you with some incontrovertible evidence, at least another side of the story which today is being suppressed in this nation, the land of the free, the home of the brave. And we pray that through sharing with you the story, that you will again begin to seek the scriptures and seek the truth and study the Constitution to see what you can do to effect change in this great land of ours, America. Act today.
This is part 3 and last in the series, The Killing of Gordon Kahl, with Len Martin, Jack McClam, and Ron Poach.
There's something that needs to be said at this time, and that is that there's a very widely held belief in America and among many people in the Western world that's very erroneous, and that is anything that's lawful is therefore proper. We need to translate that or say it another way, and that is things are just because the law makes them so. The law cannot make something just. The law can make something legal, but it can never make it just. And today we have evil, unbiblical laws that we've been saddled with that have become instruments of tyranny and injustice. One of the things that I wanted to share with you at this time is the cold-blooded murder, and we can't call it anything else but murder, that took place in Smithville, Arkansas. And I wanted to ask you, Len, what were the circumstances that took Gordon Kahl down to Arkansas?
Well, one can only speculate on why Gordon went to Arkansas, but I would imagine it would be because he at one time had lived in Arkansas and was acquainted in that area.
Graham has done more study in this as an officer of the law. He was interested in what took place and how the police officers reacted. And maybe, Jack, you could help us out in telling the whys and the wherefores of what happened down in Arkansas. And I wanted to ask this parenthetically in asking this question. Was there any attempt to get Gordon Kahl to surrender when the law enforcement officers had him surrounded there in Arkansas, that you know of?
Well, in answering this question, let me first of all go back and explain what would be done and what is done pretty well in the same fashion across this nation when you have a person in a building that you wish to extract. Number one, that person is given every opportunity to surrender, and if the person doesn't surrender, it is called a barricade situation. And barricade situations are handled generally for the first few minutes by the local law enforcement people that have come upon that individual. In this situation, it was the fugitive that they believed was Gordon Kahl. And within the first few minutes, they will try to establish contact with the person inside the building, the fugitive. After contact is made, they will secure, because they want to know if the person is indeed in the building, and it's not just hearsay that someone said this individual is indeed in the building. Once they establish the person is there, they will set a perimeter around the building, and at that time when it's secure, and especially if they know no one else is inside the building, they have all the time in the world to plan and also to attempt to bring that person out and allow them to surrender without any violence being brought upon either side. Now, this is done daily in Arizona, where I'm from, in the city of Phoenix, Arizona. It's done throughout every state in the United States. This is the system that's followed. If there's no chance of that person injuring someone because he's in the building alone, and they can surround and detain the individual, then they have all the time in the world to contact and try to persuade the person to lay down their weapons and come out peaceably and be arrested. We have all heard, and also even seen on television at times, barricade situations where the police become involved. The first few minutes, a command post and a communication is set up with the individual who is the fugitive or the person that wants to be brought out. And then it's turned over to a team of experts. Every city police department have experts in barricade situations. They're trained, very highly trained, in how to psychologically persuade people to to come out peaceably. That's why all over this great nation we have very few situations out of the thousands of barricade situations that occur weekly anyway in this nation. Very seldom do you ever hear of a shootout ensuing where they actually have to shoot and take the life of the fugitive, or that the fugitive would take the life of a police officer. And the reason for this is because they take an extreme amount of time after they have the situation under control into trying to make the outcome be favorable to both parties. Now, as we look from the eye of a law enforcement officer of some 10 years, who has seen many barricade situations and participated in many barricade situations, we find that none of these procedures were followed. Once again, similar to what we found in the investigation in North Dakota, when every common sense and basic tactic for serving the warrant on Gordon Kahl was violated, and actually what was put in its place of common sense tactics was tactics that ignited a very dangerous and a violent situation where people died who should not have had to die. The same thing in Arkansas. Every basic barricade situation, rule, if you want to call it that, guidelines was violated. No attempt, according to testimony, was made to try to ascertain if the person inside the building would be willing to come out without any type of a struggle or violent situation erupting at the time.
Well, I want to now direct my attention, I think it's germane to the Arkansas affair. What was the time frame between the Medina incident where the U.S. Marshals were killed and this Arkansas episode? What was the time frame here so that the people might be able to understand better in their mind the framework of weeks or months or days that were involved?
The attack in North Dakota was on February 13th. Gordon was killed in Arkansas June 3rd, about 3.5 months.
Well, whose home was he staying in? Were the people there aware that he was such a dangerous criminal? Tell us something about the people and what happened when the police officers came that day. Was it a SWAT team? I know most people have no idea really what took place.
Well, Norma and Leonard Ginter were patriots, and they had Gordon in their home. It was a home that was built into the side of a hill. They called it a bunker-type establishment, but there are many homes that are built like that to conserve energy. When
how old was the couple?
Oh, the Ginters are, I believe, in their 60s. Now, just before the attack, Leonard Ginter went out. He says, "I'm going to go fishing," and he went down a little ways on the narrow road. It was just room enough for one car. He met the law officials, and he had to back up into the yard. Then the officials told him to call his wife out of the house. So he did. She came out. They handcuffed them and had them lying on the ground. They took them away from the, first they had them lying on the ground, then they had them stand and took them away from the house so they couldn't hear what was going on inside. I believe it was Mrs. Ginter that said that they acted wild, as if they were on dope. Some of the officials urinated in front of her, and it was.
Well, let me ask this: did the Ginters have a history of violent behavior? Were they felons? Had they ever spent any time in jail ever?
No, they haven't. No.
How would you describe them? Were they a peace-loving group of people? Were they churchgoers? Were they Mr. Average USA, American small-time farmer, little garden plot in the back, white picket fence? I mean...
Well, yes. from what I've learned, because I didn't know them personally, but from what I've learned, they were part of a group of people who were trying to restore our country to that under the Constitution, and they didn't have much money. They were existing on a small check that Leonard was getting. The home that they were in was rented. It belonged to Bill Wade, and but being patriots that they were, when Gordon did come down there, they were willing to put him up, irregardless of what the consequences might be.
Well, let me ask you, Jack, as an officer of the law, as you understand techniques and tactics and ballistics and the logistics of the situation that was there in Arkansas, was the matter handled correctly? Or did they get the right person?
I don't think that there's going to be any officer that was not present that day. Out of the 28, I think there was 28 altogether of federal, county, and state officers that were in on this situation there at the Ginter home, that would say that that situation was handled properly. From what we know and what we've seen and been participants in ourselves as law enforcement officers here in the United States, we have never, the officers I've spoken to have never seen anything like that before in their lives. Where, and then the testimony and the stories of each of the officers after this occurred, so many of them had variations and direct contradictions in their stories as to what occurred. The attack on the home for hours upon hours after the person in the building, and even at this time, certain individuals are not sure that that was Gordon Kahl that was in the building. But the medical examiner seems to believe it was, and so stated in his autopsy report. But the actual procedures that were followed were from some texts none of us have ever seen as to how the attack on that home took place, without attempting in any fashion to try to communicate with the person inside and bring them out without a violent confrontation. If this had been done, Sheriff Gene Matthews would not be dead today, and possibly, more than likely, the person inside the home would not be dead today.
Well, could you comment on the fact of two people that were killed? And it seems like the entrance of the projectile, the bullet, came in the back of the dead man's head. I don't understand how this could happen if they were shooting directly at one another, and the different directions that these bullets were supposed to have made. Was he assassinated? Was he killed? Did they have him in custody? From your understanding, how can this be explained to the people that are watching this video? They want to know some answers. They deserve to know some answers. They have been not forthcoming since, there's been a grand scale cover-up. Individuals would like to know what really happened that day in Arkansas, because if it could happen there, well, then it could happen anywhere. And people today need to be informed in a way in which they can reconstruct this in their thinking, because we have been lied to. As a nation, we've been lied to. This isn't the first time. It's happened time and time and time again. And you know that as an officer, having served the public and having seen the cover-up of the Warren Commission, we still don't have answers to many things that are affecting this nation, and people deserve to know from a standpoint of law what really took place that day.
I believe that just by going over a few of the actual methods used on that day in June in this barricade situation, that even any member of the public who has not been involved for years in law enforcement in these type of situations would shake their head and just have a real problem understanding why some of the highest trained federal officials in our nation and local officials too that are very well trained would use these type of methods in order to bring to an end this tragic situation that started in North Dakota. Let's go to the home and see if we can build a little scenario. I'm not going to go into real minute details because it is quite a lot to the story, but basically we find the 28 officers there. They have since removed the Ginters and to a safe point. There's some thoughts that on part of some people that they were removed where they couldn't hear what was actually going on, but we could say that maybe this was for safety, that they were removed so far away from the scene. What we find now is, and there's a lot of discrepancies in the stories of the FBI and the local officers as to exactly what happened, but what we do find is that Sheriff Gene Matthews evidently did enter the home. And when he entered the home, he was shot. He took one projectile from what they think was a .22 caliber, actually a .223 caliber weapon, a very small projectile like a .22 rifle. Underneath, in the left side, entering around his vest, his bulletproof vest. There is an area on some vests that make you vulnerable to bullets still. And it entered in on the left, like in this direction, into his arm, actually, his left arm, into the body. And some of the officials seem to think the bullet went in and out of the vest and then back into the body, and actually was the round that killed Gene Matthews. Now, interesting enough, though, he did have a shotgun blast in the back also. Now, most of us in law enforcement, most shootings occur in a split second. It seems to me it'd be very difficult for one person to shoot two weapons within a very brief time in an individual and cause them to collapse because of these injuries. And so there's some real discrepancies as to why he was shot in the back with a shotgun, which Gordon Kahl, or the person inside the home, we're still not sure it's Gordon Kahl, didn't have a shotgun in the home. He did have a rifle in the home that was a .22 caliber type weapon. Okay, well, at the same time we find that Gordon Kahl is shot in an execution type fashion. This could have been just coincidental, that he was shot in a fashion that is not unknown to officers as an assassination type shooting, where you shoot behind the ear on either side of the head up into the cranium area and immediately and instantly kill a person. For us as lawmen to comprehend how these two individuals, as the FBI, the head of the FBI said at the scene, that Gene Matthews, Sheriff Gene Matthews and Gordon Kahl actually had a shootout, a brief shootout, and killed each other. It's just hard to understand how that could happen. And no scenario makes any sense to understand how these two could have killed themselves. Nor does it make any sense that for 2 hours after this person that was killed inside the home and the sheriff was dead, the police at the scene spent 2 hours shooting shells into the home, bullets into the home. Thousands of rounds were expended. We've never heard of anything like that, even in war. You know, in war scenarios, we've never seen anything like that. Also, it has been shown that the police asked to have gasoline brought to the home. These were, I guess, the federal officials there. It was found by some of the neighbors who had police scanners that they requested that gasoline be brought to the home. And this gasoline was poured into the home through the air vents, and the home was actually set on fire.
When Gordon was found to be in the home, how did the police officers who had been chasing him 3 months know he was there? Who was the informer? How did it happen? Did they infiltrate the Ginter's home? How was he found out to be there?
There was the daughter, a grown daughter of one of the patriots, who succumbed to the offer of a $25,000 reward. And it was through this that they found out that Gordon was there.
Jack, I understand that you requested and asked for an autopsy report. I understand that was also forthcoming. Could you comment on that autopsy report? Because I know as an officer you've received and you've gone through many of them and have had an understanding of what an autopsy report contains. Were there any discrepancies in it?
I believe that first we should describe what was found once the fire abated and the gunfire also subsequently was stopped at the scene, and describe what they found when they went into the building. The body that was to be found, the only body to be found in the building, was very much burned over probably 90% of its body. And there were some interesting things that were found. The feet, the hands, and the jaw were destroyed, and by that, don't let me mislead you, the feet and the hands were gone and missing. There were no hands, forearms, or legs below the knee. Very, very little. They were actually missing. And they also found that the jaw had been crushed on the body. The jaw had been actually crushed. This is what I received as some of the descriptions of what was found in the building. Now, the next thing was when the body was removed and taken by the marshals and the FBI, the federal people, to have the autopsy done. The autopsy was completed, and the description by the medical examiner of what he found led me as a trained police officer, and I'm sure anyone reading that report, that the extremities of that body were actually burned off by the intense fire in the building. Now, for years as a police officer, I have known what every medical examiner knows across this country, is that the extreme heat, when a person is caught in a fire, and the extreme heat caused by that fire is never intense enough to burn the extremities totally off the body. I've been at many scenes of fires where children and people have been burned up, and never have I found feet and arms gone, totally disintegrated from a body. So what we find in the autopsy report is the medical examiner actually saying that these items had disintegrated, and knowing full well that this is impossible. Even under cremation situations where you take a loved one to be cremated after a funeral, the extremities, the bones, actually do not disintegrate most of the time, even at these very extreme heats. So we know that it was not possible for these limbs just to disintegrate. Now, what was also found in some of the pictures viewed by specialists that was also not reported in the autopsy report is that there were actually bones extruding from the torso, which was about all that was left, where they had actual hack marks as if a sharp object had severed the bone, the hands, the feet, and the arms and so forth from the torso.
I've got to, this is very overwhelming, because what it points to, it seems like the logical reasons of deduction is that the man was tortured. The individual, whoever that was in the fire, was tortured prior to assassination or the bullet holes in the body. Is that what you're saying, Jay?
There's no way for me to get the information, and I don't know if any of us can at this time get the information that's needed to make that confirmed assessment, because of the fact that the autopsy, we can just go out and say that it was done improperly. or it's difficult to say that this man wasn't qualified to do autopsies when he had been in the business for years, but let's just say that the autopsy is pretty much useless, and we don't know if the person was dead at the time that their arms and legs were hacked off and their jawbone crushed, or if they were alive at that time. So that's a difficult question to answer. However, we do know that these are the items that are used, the jaws, the hands and the feet are used many times for proving the identity of a person that has been killed.
Well, I know, fellows, that what we're going to do is we're going to raise many questions to the public out there, especially with the fact of talking about this body that was found in the fire. If it wasn't, and we've got to pose this, if it wasn't Gordon's body, and if he wasn't found in that house, then where is he, and what did they do, or could he still be alive? That's the question we've got to ask.
Well, from a law enforcement point of view, we must say, of course, that we're not sure that Gordon is alive, but posed with the problem or the question, what would occur if he was still alive? Let's look at this. The very people that are generally responsible for witness protection programs that protect witnesses before they go to court to testify are all involved in this unbelievable scenario that was played out in two parts of our country. Unbelievable to any officer I've ever talked to. And so if Gordon Kahl was to eventually show himself in some other part of the country or the world and want to come forward and testify, you understand that he could not go and feel secure with the federal authorities that provide the protection program. So all I can surmise is that the patriots themselves would have to form such a tight security ring and then invite in the media to a location that could be secured very well and have him go immediately live on the major medias if they could be enticed to a location without the word getting out to the federal authorities. This is just incredible to even be talking about this idea that maybe this would have to be done, that he would have to be protected from the very people in our nation that are responsible for protecting the public. But that's exactly what would have to be done.
In other words, what you're saying is if he would show up someplace, don't call the FBI or don't call the federal marshals to get some type of protection for him.
I'm sorry to say that's exactly right.
Also, coming back now, if this wasn't Gordon Kahl's body that was buried, then whose body was it, and what scenario worst case scenario can we say took place that day, and why did Sheriff, what was his name?
Gene Matthews.
Gene Matthews. Why was he killed, or was he backing out of something? Was he saying, I'm not going to be part of this? Could this be a possibility?
Well, let me tell you what you try to give percentages to exactly how the thing might have been played out up there, and after about 6 months investigation myself, looking at the evidence, what I believe could have occurred is that, and this was reported by one of the neighbors there that overheard a police officer referring to this, that someone at the scene, one of the officers, had seen the body before it was burned. And he said, oh my God, they've killed Bill Wade, which would be the owner of the home. And this was never brought up in court that we know of, but what I had been thinking all along as a police officer is if the sources of identification were removed from the body, there was a possibility that for some reason they had thought that they had killed the wrong person. And someone got terribly afraid of what would happen, and so the forms of identification was removed. The jawbone was crushed, the hands and feet removed from the body, and then the fire was started to try to obliterate any other parts of the body that could, and also the scene itself, the crime scene itself, as to exactly what had happened. And so if indeed this was overheard that, oh my God, they killed Bill Wade, then possibly that is what occurred to cause this type of a mutilation of the body. However, as Len did say, there was other evidence of a beating that this body underwent. There was terrible hemorrhaging other than just the gunshot to the cranial area, and that was in the autopsy. And then there was 5 broken ribs that were, the body was in the middle of the building, and the roof didn't cave in. It was a block building, and so nothing could have crushed those ribs except a blow. And so we just don't know at this point if indeed the law enforcement people thought that they had killed the wrong person and then mutilated the body. However, one of the feet, a portion of this person's foot, was found in the fire, after the fire, by a New York Times reporter, I think about a week later. And he stated that it looked like that the end of that foot, I believe it was the right foot, just above the toes, right in the middle of your foot, where your shoelaces would tie, it had been severed like with a sharp instrument. Now, when that was turned over to the medical examiner, he said it was burned off in the fire. And this is hard to understand, why to a reporter he could see the bones had been severed, and to understand how a fire could burn and sever a foot immediately in one spot is just hard to understand how that could happen.
In all the autopsy reports, you've never seen a report like this?
Never seen anything like this. Never have I ever seen a body dismembered by a fire.
Well, Len, let me ask you the question. In terms of dollars, how much of taxpayer dollars has it taken to apprehend, kill Gordon Kahl, murder him, cold-blooded, or whoever was killed? What's the dollar figure been in this whole grisly episode?
We don't know how many people were involved in trying to find Gordon Kahl and participate in the cover-up afterwards. The Fargo Forum carried a story that the trial had cost $100,000. But that wouldn't include the 60 marshals that were at Jamestown and how many hundreds of other that were going all over the United States. And they did go talking to people in Portland, Oregon, and Massachusetts, and every point that patriots around the country getting information, supposedly looking for Gordon Kahl. The cost of that, the travel, the telephone calls, the meals, and then the big item, and that is the keeping the 3 fellows in prison. And if you figured the 10 years for Dave Brewer and the normal lifetime for Scott and Yori, it might amount to about 100 years. I figured it at $20,000 and came up with a figure in some ways like $3 million. Now I read where it costs $50,000 to keep a prisoner in a federal prison. Well, I make it $5 million right there. So that's what the taxpayer is going to cost the taxpayer to pick up a person on a misdemeanor. Pretty ridiculous.
In coming to the conclusion of the video today, I think that there indeed has been injustice done to these men, and is continuing to happen and can happen to you. In the face of this injustice, I want to have these men respond in some final comments and tell you their thoughts, and then I'll conclude by sharing a word, hopefully, that will stir you to some type of responsible action.
Would you want to start, Len?
All right. I would like to comment on the reaction of the people in North Dakota. After the shooting, there was bewilderment, questions. Some were angry about it. Probably a greater percentage were disgusted with it when they found out that it was, they could have gotten Gordon anytime they wanted, and they staged an attack like that on a Sunday. I asked I was at a trial in Fargo, and one of the marshals was there, and he said, "Hey, Len, how's fishing out around Detroit lakes?" And I said, "I don't have much time for that." And then he said to me, or asked me, why don't you get a decent job? And I said, not until this thing is settled. He says, well, there won't be a next time. He says, the next time we'll do things differently. And I said, well, the people in North Dakota and the surrounding area are pretty angry over what took place. He didn't deny it. His only comment was, says, well, about 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1% are going to do anything about it. Well, the situation has changed now. I've talked to people who said that now that the farm economy and the economy in general is so bad, people are becoming, are saying, well, Gordon Kahl was right. And especially with the farm foreclosures, where they're just simply going out and taking a farm, even if he tries to protect it with constitutional means, they go out and take it anyway. And so this is adding to the more receptiveness and anti-government, and I hate to say government, this is our government, the officials that have taken it over. So the mood is the time is ripe for a full-scale investigation and a retrial. In fact, the investigation is going on right now, but it has to be done so carefully. And at some point, hopefully, with the grace of God, that it's going to blow wide open.
Jack, some final comments from you.
I think that, in a police officer's life of dealing with violence and crime and corruption over the years, and in my particular case, this is probably the saddest situation I've ever seen in all of my years as a law enforcement officer, and this is the reason why. I took the job as a protector of the public. Law enforcement officers used to be called peace officers. If you notice today, they're called enforcement officers. We actually today are not the protectors of the public we once were. We used to protect our citizens and our communities even from an overzealous government agent. Today we work directly under government agents, and we are the enforcement arm of an overzealous government at this time. This needs to be changed, because I know thousands and thousands of officers, myself personally, that are proud individuals and working to try to do the best they can for their communities. But this is one of the greatest blights that needs to be cleared up that's ever occurred in law enforcement that those officers and I have ever heard of. We want it to be straightened out. We want an investigation into this.
Well, that comes down to the final question as to why have we made this tape? Well, we wanted to inform you what the big boys in the media, CBS, ABC, NBC, would never tell you. Another thing we wanted to do was to have you join with us and pray. There is an effective area of prayer that seemingly we have forgotten to accept our priesthood responsibility as a nation. Pray that funds will come in, enough money to accelerate this private investigation that Len was talking about. And then we want to stir you as a people, because we want you to get to know the Constitution. We want you to understand that this book is God's holy law, and we as a people have violated His law. And I want to thank today Len Martin, a writer, and he has written this book, The Attack on Gordon Kahl. It's available at the address that you'll see at the end of the broadcast today. We want you to be informed. Read the book. Listen to, again, view this video again, and see if we've told you a measure of truth whereby you can be responsible in your actions. Another individual I want to thank personally is Jack McLam for being here with us today. And Yuri Kahl, Scott Fall, and Dave Boer, we've not forgotten you either. And Mrs. Kahl, thank you for your excerpt. I know it's been very difficult for you to rehearse these moments of great grief and pathos that have personally affected your life. But we want to thank you for viewing, and we pray that you will be moved to action so that you and your children will live in this great country, America, as free Americans, as those that love God's law, and honor the Constitution of the United States of America. God bless you.
This program is brought to you by Lord's Covenant Church and is available on either VHS or beta.